Hi everyone. Um, in the last session, we spoke about taking advantages of change in opportunities, and we spoke about the stunted crocodile, where we mentioned how growth restrictions can actually impact living being from growing beyond the restrictions that it has, and similarly how it impacts managers in terms of their mental growth and things like that. So, in this session, we are going to talk about the snail and the lobster. That's what the chapter's title is. And we are going to learn from threats. So, how threats can actually be helpful in learning. So, um, again, this is part of nature's, learning. So, this is again a chapter where Gopal uses nature as a learning mechanism to teach us how threats can, create a challenge in species, and similarly how threats in organizational environment can be helpful for managers and people. Um, so the first introduction starts off with saying talking about the snail and the lobster actually. So he basically starts off the session saying that starts off the chapter saying that think of how junior staff responds to leadership initiatives or how unions respond to management initiatives. I mean, unions don't exist a lot now, but yeah, there have been in the past unions have completely broken down companies. Dunlop is one example. Britannia is another example where companies have had the impact of unions and their demands and things like that. So he says, in India, there is so much comfort among the staff of public sector undertakings and government departments that they oppose disinvestment in any form. Too many people want to keep up the status quo, which is true actually, right? And that's what happens in many organizations also. People are not ready to change and they want to keep the status quo and things like that. So he gives an example of snail and lobster. So he says the snail is an animal with a soft body that is covered with a coiled shell. It likes moist weather. So it basically says that he basically says that when the weather becomes dry, the animal responds by exuding a slimy substance. When this liquid dries up, it seals the snail inside its shell. It literally cuts itself off from the world. When it moves, it does so with a muscular action of its foot, but the muscles actually move in a backward wave like motion. So it moves forward by exercising its muscles backwards. The snail has an enemy in the lobster, for it forms the latter's favorite diet. From the slow snail's point of view, the lobster is a fast mover and is quite horrendous. It has 5 pairs of legs, meaning the lobster. The top one near its head is like a powerful pair of pincers that can grab its prey and hold it viciously. It is a fighter, and in case it loses a limb or a claw in battle, it grows a new one in its place. So, when the snail grew in an environment free of the predator, which is the lobster, it began to reproduce when the shell size was just 4 millimeter. Its lifespan was about 4 months. Then the experimenter introduced the crayfish predator. So you'll have to understand this. We are talking about lobster and crayfish. Crayfish is a type of lobster. So basically, when the lobster was not around, the snail was actually growing at, it began to reproduce when the shell size was just 4 millimeter. But he says that once the lobster, when the crayfish, which is a type of lobster, was introduced, what happened? The snail had to have some response to this threat because life could not carry on normally any longer. First, it had to use some method to avoid the crayfish, and second, prepare how to respond if it did meet its enemy. The snails now postponed reproduction till they were twice their size, 8 millimeter instead of 4 millimeters, and their longevity increased to 12 months from 4 months. The threat actually improved all the growth parameters. The scientists hypothesized that when faced with the threat, the snail reallocated its resources away from early reproduction towards growth and community survival. So the most important takeaway that we are going to learn from this lesson is when in circumstances of threat, you actually reallocate resources and you also try to revisit the whole parameter, which is like moving from a dimension that was earlier considered to be your norm, right? So that's what you do. So uh, The next thing that he talks about is, he gives an example of a crocodile in a different context. He talks about how Thailand had challenges adapting to, Chinese crocodiles and things like, sorry, how Chinese crocodiles had challenges adapting to Thailand. I'm not getting into this actually, but this is a good example. I think some of you will know this already, right? How Japanese fish were threatened by sharks. So the Japanese have loved fresh fish, but the waters close to Japan have not held much fish for decades. To feed the population, the fishing boats got bigger and went farther than ever. The farther the fishermen went, the longer it took them to bring in the fish. If the return trip took more than a few days, the fish was not fresh. The Japanese did not like the taste. To solve this problem, fishing companies installed freezers on their boats. They would catch the fish and freeze them at sea. Unfortunately, the consumer could taste the difference between fresh and frozen fish. The frozen fish fetched a lower price. So fishing companies installed fish tanks on the ship. They would catch the fish and stuff them in the tanks. After a little thrashing around, the fish stopped moving. They were dull and tired, but alive. Unfortunately, the Japanese could still taste the difference. They liked the taste of lively, fresh fish and not sluggish fish. Finally, they hit upon an idea. They added a small shark to each tank. The shark did eat a few fish, but the rest of them were challenged and kept on the move by the shark. The Japanese consumer got the freshest possible fish. When faced with a threat, two key responses are involved. First, an adaptation to survive, and later, a reallocation of resources. Quite often, the adaptation to survive takes the form of deception when the animal learns to pretend what it is not. The same principles apply to organizations, and it is instructive to trace the parallels between nature's way of coping and the way organizations and individuals do. The simplest form is camouflage. Butterflies and moths often have colors and textures that make them indistinguishable from a leaf or a tree bark. There is a reptile called the Malaysian flying gecko, which lies flat and immobile on a tree trunk and is almost impossible to pick out separately from the tree trunk. There are managers who criticize company policies privately, but when the boss is around, they speak vehemently in favor of the same. They are like the chameleon that changes its color to harmonize with the background. A second form of deception is mimicry. For example, some tropical spiders are similar in appearance to the ants on which they feed. There are colleagues who pretend to be part of your group as peers in private conversations, but end up carrying tales to the seniors who have their own reasons for not discouraging such behavior. It is like the predator that adopts a form which lulls its prey into believing it is something else. A third form of deception is simulation. A prey animal may simulate a tactic to remind the predator of a previous bad experience. For example, a drone fly can buzz like a honeybee to keep away trouble. A group of long-standing employees who do not wish to change their way of working may warn the enthusiastic new head about the bad results from a previous attempt to introduce change. So these are all some challenges, right? I mean, I had a low battery, so I had to just click on the screen. Sorry. So when threatened by a snake, squirrels gang up together and display aggressive behavior. The squirrels do this by making their hair stand erect, flagging their tails, bobbing their heads, and kicking up sand to scare off the snake. In a similar manner, the manager who does not want to lay off his people in a corporate rationalization exercise may get them to write a representation directly to the bigger boss. Imitation, flattery, excessive zeal to agree with the boss's opinions, all these are the organizational equivalents of using deception to survive. The other interesting thing is, Gopal says, survival is never assured in nature. It is never assured in nature. No animal behaves as though its existence is assured even for a day. Each morning, every animal figures out how to survive the threats in its environment and how to get its quota of food for the day. Similarly, managers should figure out how not to become bonsai. The African gazelle, a gazelle is a type of deer, the African gazelle need not learn to run faster than a leopard. It needs to run faster than the next gazelle to survive. It is only the human being who assumes that his survival is more or less assured, whether it is his job in a company or his life in the community. By understanding how animals